Welcome everyone to today's seminar. My name's Joe Ford. I'm a lecturer in French Studies at the Institute of Modern Languages Research. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to the second seminar this term in our World Literature and Translation series. The series is convened together with LINCS, the London Intercollegiate Network for Comparative Studies. And today's seminar in particular, we're co-convening with CLACS, which is the Center for Caribbean and Latin American Studies, which sits within the Institute of Modern Languages Research. So I'm delighted that we could bring Isabel here, virtually, albeit virtually, in this kind of joint venture between CLACS, LINCS, and the IMLR. The series is designed to bring together scholars, teachers, students working in languages context. So thinking about primarily modern languages, but also area studies, linguistics. We have a very broad remit, as you'll see from some of the previous events on our website, in terms of the main aim is really to think with and perhaps deconstruct concepts such as world literature and translation. And I'm really delighted to say that I think our speaker today is going to do precisely that. Before I introduce Isabel, we are in seminar mode today. As you'll notice, you probably already know the kind of how Zoom works. The chat is open. You can post in the chat as Isabel is speaking, and I'll come back to the chat during the discussion and Q&A at the end and pick up on any questions. If you'd like to ask a question in person or live, then you're very welcome to switch your camera on. You can unmute yourself and ask a question during the Q&A. Isabel's going to speak for around 45 minutes, and then we'll have about half an hour for questions, discussion at the end. So today's session is being recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded, then just keep your camera off and you can post your questions in the chat. That's absolutely fine. And I'll now introduce our speaker. Isabel Gómez is an assistant professor of Latin American and Iberian Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where her research and teaching focus on Latin American literatures and translation studies. Recent publications can be found in Translation Review, the Journal of World Literature, Mutadis Mutandis, and Hispanic Journal. Her first book, titled Cannibal Translation, Literary Reciprocity in Contemporary Latin America, is forthcoming with the Flashpoint series published by Northwestern University Press. And the book illuminates translation practices of 20th century Latin American authors as forms of creative destruction and homage. As a member of the Executive Council of the ICLA, International Comparative Literature Association, and president of the Standing Research Committee on Translation Studies, Isabel's inviting interesting scholars to participate in the summer 2022 ACLA and ICLA conferences, where she's organizing seminars on translation and reparation. And I'm sure Isabel will be happy to talk more about that in the discussion and Q&A if people are interested. Isabel's title today is Cannibal Translation and Latin American Anthologies of World Literature. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Isabel. Thank you very much.
Marvelous. Thank you so much, Joe, for this delightful invitation. I'm really honored to be a participant in the Convocation seminars in world literature and translation. Thanks also to the hosts here today, including the University of London Institute of Modern Languages Research School of Advanced Study, the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and the London Intercollegiate Network for Comparative Studies. I'm also really grateful to all the colleagues and students who have taken the time to attend today. As Joe mentioned, my talk today will draw from my first book project, Cannibal Translation, Literary Reciprocity in Contemporary Latin America. And I'll share my PowerPoint just to get started here. Let's see. There we go. And what I'll be doing is starting with an overview of the whole cannibal concept, which was first a way to demonize indigenous cultures, but then later was reclaimed by the Brazilian avant-garde and eventually theorized by poets Augusto and José de Campos as a watchword for their translation practice. So in the forthcoming book, I'm locating a mode of cannibal translation in a wide range of different Latin American translation projects that, as I see it, help us as translation scholars get away from certain binaristic tendencies and logics, including, but not limited to, domestication versus foreignization, source language versus target language, or even center versus periphery. Then the bulk of my talk is going to zoom in on one particular chapter where I'm analyzing very idiosyncratic world literature anthologies by Mexican poet José Emilio Pacheco and Brazilian poet Augusto de Campos. And in these anthologies, I see the poets using cannibal translation techniques to stage critiques of the very organizing principles of a world literature anthology. And in doing so, they end up elevating subaltern figures in their own literary canons, while also experimenting with aesthetic remixes that really problematize the colonial past of translation, while also performing its decolonial potential. So I'm going to start with two epigraphs, first from Walter Benjamin: "Genuine polemics approach a book as lovingly as a cannibal spices a baby." Very widely recognized quote. Second, less so, by José de Campos: "The cannibal was a polemicist, from the Greek polemos, meaning struggle, combat, but he was also an anthologist. He devoured only the enemies he considered courageous, taking their marrow and protein to fortify and renew his own natural energies." So as you may know, the word cannibal itself is a neologism. In fact, the first neologism born out of the violent encounter between Eastern and Western hemispheric cultures, in which European colonizers misheard an indigenous people's name for themselves, the Carib, and then associated the Carib, or what they called the cannibal, with reports of human consumption in the region. This trope of the cannibal has a long history within European ideas about Latin America, and then as a concept reclaimed and uplifted from Latin America. But just suffice to say for now that the image of the cannibal was pegged to Brazil from earliest days of transatlantic colonization, as we see in this 16th century map. And I'll zoom in here to show the Cannibali of Brazil as imagined by the European map maker. And this image remained very stable in European visualizations of the region. As we can see, over a century later, the map has grown far more detailed. And yet the Brazilian region remains illustrated by nearly the exact same scene of cannibalism. Then in the avant-garde moment of the 1920s and 30s, we had Brazilian poet Oswaldo Jindaraji in his foundational text, the Cannibalist Manifesto, where he drew on this label that was once used to demonize to instead reverse this and claim that aesthetic devoration was Brazil's contribution to global culture. This ability to break down elements from cultures outside one's own and to recombine them with the local to produce new works was a unique and autochthonous method of Brazilian cultural production. So unlike the European fear of the cannibal, for Oswald and his revitalization of the Tupi-Guarani, this cultural practice of cannibalism was celebratory and valuable, in which worthily defeated enemies were ritually incorporated into one's own body, giving an honorable burial to the dead, and also in recognition of an intergenerational reciprocity in which their own ancestors might have been ritually eaten by the one they are now eating. So in this indigenous Brazilian worldview, cannibalism does figure into an ethical and reciprocal relationship with another. And in this decolonial light, it was used as a guiding technique for Brazilian art making. In the 1960s and 70s, Haroldo and Augusto de Campos then reactivated this avant-garde gesture from the 1920s and expanded it into a poetics of translation and not just poetic creation. So describing his approach to the poetry of the past, we have Augusto de Campos here citing Oswaldo Jindaraji directly, writing, quote, "My way of loving the ancient poets is to translate them, or to swallow them, according to Oswaldo Jindaraji's anthropophagic law. I only care about what is not mine, the untranslated and the untranslatable." Here we might see Augusto anticipating Emily Apter's untranslatable, which he will put into his practice of untranslation, as I'll discuss further later on. In my book, I'm examining the way these creative translation practices from Brazil circulated into Spanish and elsewhere into Latin America. And so if the vision of the cannibal has been attached to Brazil and to Latin America since colonization, the use of cannibal translation incorporates this history at a critical angle. The ethical stakes of my project include celebrating translations into languages of language varieties of Spanish and Portuguese in Latin America, figuring Latin America as a producer of its own translation theories, and imagining translation as a mode of encountering difference relationally and reciprocally, rather than through economic structures of extraction or consecration. Rather than the unidirectional translatio, with cannibal translation, I'm often seeing a reciprocal practice. I'm also following Judith Butler and Sandra Berman in their view of translation as, quote, a model for political and ethical relationality, in which there's a counter-hegemonic alternative to the nation that, quote, makes a demand that's ethical on the reader to not simply assimilate what is foreign into what is familiar, but rather serve as an opening to the unfamiliar. So along with David Damrosch, who has framed world literature as a mode of reading, I concur there, but I also, aligned with Lawrence Venuti, see that we have a challenge that, quote, we are still in the process of learning how to read translations as translations. So if world literature can often tend to present readers with an appealing, nicely plated meal that's seasoned according to the knowledge base and tastes of the target culture, even with a nice spice of foreignization mixed in there. What we have with cannibal translation is instead that readers are shown how the sausage is made, what is happening in the process, and how it might be reciprocated. Cannibal translation, therefore, can offer the growing field of world literature a practice of reading translations as translations that evokes productive suspicion and produces an interest in the process as mediated, unfinished, and lovingly destructive. So now for the translation collections by José Emilio Pacheco in Mexico and Augusto de Campos in Brazil, Aproximaciones and O Anticrítico, which each take a fragmentary and transgressive approach, collecting world literature at a critical slant. Reading these two translation anthologies together, I'm highlighting their shared conceptual use of translational heteronyms as a critique of assimilationist framing within world literature. So both collections do share the organizing logic of many anthologies of world literature, which to me makes them recognizable and readable as critiques of that genre. These shared traits include chronological organization that spans many centuries, uniting literatures from many languages into one language, presenting great works or great names in new translation, framing works and authors with biographical, critical literary commentaries, so kind of a pedagogical framing. And yet, these two anthologies of world literature counter and craft different approaches to translating world literature. One where they're centering a translation history and highlighting how it was often problematic, violent, and built on colonial logic. Additionally, not all of the texts they translate have a clear source. Sometimes they're even combining sources or inventing sources or mediating their source texts so thoroughly that there's a lot of contestation possible. Other moments, the genre of the translation actually differs significantly from the genre of the source text, and yet they still attach translation as a label here. Furthermore, they include the target culture of Mexico and of Brazil, not as a passive receiver of knowledge originating elsewhere, but also as a filter, mediator, and producer of world literature. So by insisting and including their own national literatures into these world literature anthologies, which, by the way, those national literatures are also still needing to be translated to fit into their anthologizing logic. In doing so, they're countering what Theodoian has called a, quote, radical dissociation of an internal and an external canon, in which world literature produced elsewhere might influence the shape a native canon may assume in the future under world literature pressure. So I'm analyzing these two Cannibal Translation collections from Latin America as antidotes to both the translation approach and the organizing logic of a world literature. One of the tools that both Pacheco and Augusto use to increase the opacity of their translation collections is creating a relationship between translation and heteronym. Heteronyms, as we might know, are invented personalities that authors or poets often adopt who are writing poetry under another name, a name other than the poet's own. Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa championed this practice, crafting many heteronyms with unique biographies, voices, and relationships to different poetic traditions. Augusto himself claimed, quote, translation is, for me, persona, almost a heteronym. Climb inside the pretender's skin to refine all over again, pain for pain, sound for sound, color for color. That's why I never set out to translate everything, just what I feel. This citation is dense. It also troubles the question of who is the pretender, who is wearing whose skin, the translator or the adopted persona. Augusto himself never used heteronyms, but placing his work, and along with this citation, where it's approaching heteronym, his active translation, alongside that of Pacheco, who does indeed invent heteronyms, who he translates, sort of assists me in my comparative analysis of their world literature anthologies, which, reading them together, I see them asking, what does it mean to acknowledge that in translation, the source author can become an invention, a projection of another author's voice in the target language? So in particular, Pacheco's critical approximations index the history of violent contact between indigenous and colonizing cultures in Mexico and the Americas more broadly. In a decolonial translation mode, he both critiques the Spanish language as an instrument of assimilation, but also draws on the potential of translation to reconfigure power relationships between indigenous and colonial epistemological systems. While his anthology on the surface, organized under world literature principles, reading his paratexts, we see a constant introduction of themes of indigenous reclaiming of land, rights, and recognition in the face of an enduring logic of translation as embedded in a conflict between the civilized and the barbarous. He writes that, quote, poems are only remote, ancient, or foreign when we don't make them our own by any lawful or unlawful means, if we don't take them by assault in the most savage and civilizing of all tasks. In this aggressive image akin to the skin Augusto wears of the source author's persona, Pacheco goes on to introduce himself as a translator in a long line of other translators that in fact began with an indigenous transculturation. So he is just, quote, a humble Mexican interpreter. Another one in the chain that began when Fernando de Alva Ixtlilxochitl translated the poems of his great-grandfather, Nezahualcóyotl, into lyric verse in the style of Fray Luis de Leon. And it has not been interrupted, nor will it ever cease. The true author of these approximations is the Spanish language. In this way, he reminds his readers that, at least in Mexico, Spanish has always been a language of translation. So from this polyvocal and transhistorical position, Pacheco invents heteronyms and performatively collects these poets of no renown whatsoever, alongside many other recognized hallmarks of world literature, like Petrarch, Goethe, Rilke, etc. So using the mouthpiece of an invented Brazilian heteronym, Pacheco ends up critiquing Mexican ideologies of racial hierarchies. The poet Aurelio Azevedo Oliveira serves Pacheco as the mask of a Brazilian poet of exactly his generation, who shares his political concerns. And in the posthumous Poemario Bugraria by Oliveira, which Pacheco translates in full, he takes his title from a derogatory Brazilian word, bugre, which refers to an urbanized or semi-assimilated indigenous person, recalling a history of dehumanizing language used to describe indigenous peoples in the Western Hemisphere, especially after forced displacements. Pacheco glosses this offensive Brazilian word as the equivalent of the Mexican term naco, used to express an identical racialized judgment, revealing, of course, that he is not translating indeed from the Brazilian Portuguese, but rather inventing a voice from Brazil through which to speak about Mexico. So the last poem of the anthology, Aproximaciones, ostensibly written by this heteronym Azevedo Oliveira, titled Western, depicts the mass-produced and ideologically problematic Hollywood vision of the Wild West in order to critique artistic conventions and conventions of translation, which perpetuate a series of genre norms that police the boundary between the so-called civilized and savage. Set in a Rio de Janeiro movie theater with an audience of children watching a Western flick, the poem asks why and how we became so accustomed to this image, quote, to the point where we are so complicit with the representation of this alien world that we are the defenders of that fort erected in Apache territory. We are the crusaders on the last frontier, the predators of this part of America, ours. The conventions of the Hollywood Western are all fulfilled in this poem that also includes the line, quote, without convention, there is no art. By naming convention as the core of art, the poem implicates translation as a part of the complicit representation of any other culture. By convention, we must believe that the source text exists when it is labeled a translation. But what can we make of convention if the poem informs us that these conventions also encode racial hierarchies and stereotypes? While Pacheco does not resolve these concerns, he does use this heteronym, posing as a world literary author, to require readers to maintain an active and critical relationship with the construction of cultural authority, critiquing the language politics of translation within a translation anthology itself. Augusto de Campos also incorporates commentary on the formation of the Brazilian literary canon into his anthology, both as an innovative translation zone and as a source of world literature. Read as a whole, his volume O Anticrítico counters other modes of world literature by centering translation traditions, by emphasizing concrete poetic possibilities within works that did not originally possess visual elements, by including Brazil as a ready object for his translation procedures. His anthology includes world literature classics like Dante, John Donne, the Edward Fitzgerald Rubaiyat, Omar Khayyam, minimalists that Augusto returns to multiple times, like Emily Dickinson, Duchamp, John Cage, fellow language innovators like Lewis Carroll, Mallarmé, Verlaine, Gertrude Stein, and then avant-garde Spanish-American poets, Huidobro and Oliveira Girondo. And he also includes the canonical Brazilian literary figures, João Cabral de Melo Neto, Gregorio Gematos, and Euclides da Cunha. Throughout, Augusto magnifies the presence of subaltern figures in these world literary works and emphasizes aesthetic traits that do not always easily lend themselves to translation. Where Pacheco claimed a, quote, barbaric position for his irreverent translation gestures, Augusto uplifts instead the pose of the amateur, emphasizing informality and playfulness as opposed to the heaviness of the professional literary critic. That's what the title is, the anti-critic, the translator as the anti-critic here. Augusto is exploring John Cage's suggestion that, quote, the best critique of a poem is a poem. And so therefore he calls the biographical and literary historical paratexts he uses to introduce each translation, quote, porous prose, where he orients readers to understand the authors, but also glosses his own translation approach through these introductions that are structured as free verse poetry, or what he calls criticism via creative translation. In some cases, he also labels the works untranslations or intraduções, a mashup of the word in Portuguese for introduction and non-translation, in which there's a sort of refusal to translate fully, and also a move to maintain the translation in a relationship with the source. In each piece, there's a specific operation at work that's fitting to the source text, but also made explicit through these porous prose introductions. So we never get a transparent or unmediated presentation in this sort of counter anthology of world literature. For example, when he works on Lewis Carroll, he reproduces doublets from 1880 in Portuguese, but not by translating any of the semantic content in English, but rather transforming the word game, whereby transitioning one letter at a time, you move from two opposites. He chooses to do many of these games, but two of them in particular I highlighted because they're key words for Augusto in this move from lixo to oro. That's a favorite term for other poetry by Augusto, as well as prosa to poema, another insistence that the genre might be transformed along with a translation. Where other translators might have ignored these nonsense poems of Lewis Carroll in favor of other more translatable works, Augusto centers on them as generative practices and inviting readers to play along. With this approach, I see Augusto crafting translations that are at once foreignizing, entirely attuned to the norms of the source text, yet also domesticating, wholly embedded within a target language. Augusto also retranslates canonical works, but not in the invisible process of a typical world literature anthology, but rather a hyper-visible and creative remixing germane to the Cannibal translator. In the case of Dante, Augusto does not simply update other Portuguese translations. Instead, he places himself within a tradition of Brazilian translators to argue in defense of his own translation values that determined his approach. He compares his own translation of the final line of the fifth canto of Dante's Inferno to the solutions that other translators have found to render this key line in Portuguese. First, he turns that final line into a concrete poem, tracing an arc of descent down the page, repeatedly writing out in Portuguese and in Italian, "And I fell as a dead body falls, e caí como corpo morto caí," in this Portuguese, and then also the Italian. He then cites three other Brazilian translators, Xavier Pinheiro from 1888, Dante Milano from 1950, and Cristiano Martin from 1976, and points out that, quote, the others reversed this line, inverting the position of the verb. But in order to achieve the same falling syntax that he discerns and admires so much in his source text, he explains, quote, my desire to approach more closely the reflective precision of the original led me to translate Canto 5 of the Inferno from back to front, starting from the last verse. So unlike the previous three translations, which ended with morto rather than caí, to place the emphasis on the death rather than the internal fall. Unlike his own version, these translations could not be read as concrete poems, with the descending arc set up from the first line and ending with this verb fall. So recalling also Augusto's fascination with the poem A Leaf Falls by E.E. Cummings, in which the theme of a leaf falling is dramatized by the vertical layout of letters on the page. In his translation of Dante, on the left, Augusto has remixed and gifted Dante not only with his own concrete aesthetics, but also with those of another author entirely, E.E. Cummings. In this critical approach to world literature, Augusto is rejecting the assumption that each generation retranslates in a way that replaces the old. Instead, he's kind of building a place for that translation tradition within his new translation, from the present looking back to the first Brazilian translator. Augusto's Cannibal Translation approach to world literature also draws on a critical consideration of the formation of a Brazilian literary canon. One of his sources is the 17th century poet Gregorio Gematos, a Brazilian-born controversy stirrer, contemporary of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz in Mexico, known as the mouth of hell by his contemporaries. While some literary critics had viewed him as a rank imitator of Iberian Spanish poetics, or even a plagiarist right out of Quevedo or of Góngora, in his porous prose, prosa porosa introduction, Augusto rejects this reading, insisting instead that Gregorio Gematos is, quote, the first experimental cannibal in our poetry. He furthermore claims that the poet is ill-served by the literary tradition, which focuses on his sacred and lyric poems and excises all other elements of Matos's writing, which serve what Augusto calls the racially mixed or Creole and the Calmitic profane muses. In this work, titled Arte Final para Gregorio, in his world literature anthology, Augusto chooses to zoom in on specifically these forgotten muses, this comedic profane. And he selects lines from Gregorio Gematos that contain an indefensible and racist image, blowing up this cruel satire of the leadership of Bahia to draw attention to the racial and gender hierarchies that are at the core of this often erased founder of Brazilian literature. The first two repeated stanzas roughly translate as, quote, prickly feet covered up with silk, goat hair powdered with marble, in an image of an animalized racial other who has dressed himself up in the fine trappings of luxury and authority. In his essay poem Prosa Porosa Introduction, Augusto provides the context that the longer poem he's fragmenting here satirizes the historical figure of Maria Nicolas, a leader of Bahian society whom Matos is denigrating and othering in this poetry as homosexual or a ninfo gentil, and also as a racialized other, a mixed race, indigenous and Portuguese person. He insists that while scholars and editors never fail to put Matos in dialogue with the categories of Baroque Iberian poetry, of culturalismo, conceptismo, this satirical verse is given short shrift and only included in a few sparse examples that are, quote, softened by suppression and reticence. Augusto writes further that this satirical poetry is, quote, generally relegated to the kitchen, far from the anterooms where they hang the pious sonnets. Using this language, Augusto is framing this tendency in the scholarly tradition to display in the center Matos's pious sonnets and exile the profane and satiric verse to the kitchen. This is an echo of a larger Brazilian cultural division between enslavers and enslaved people, as reproduced in the spatial division between what Gilberto Freire famously called the Casa Grande and the Senzala. So with this Cannibal Translation, Augusto is not only drawing a critical eye to the anti-Black racist language at the center of this canonical figure and his own literary tradition, he's also accusing the canon makers of this tradition of reproducing a racialized division, separating and elevating only the more pious elements of Matos's poetry, and censoring or rejecting from anthologies those parts of his work that they're ashamed of that show a more homophobic and anti-Black language embedded in this Baroque era poetry. The visually sort of striking context of the untranslation that magnifies aspects of Matos's poetry that are often unexamined or censored by the scholarly tradition. And the term referenced in the title, arte final, refers to the process of finalizing the visual layout before sending a text to the printer. Furthermore, Augusto uses all these different fonts and sizes and shapes of letters, kind of imitating cut taken from newsprint of maybe a ransom note disguising handwriting or other anonymous or perhaps threatening missives. This was, in fact, the way that many of Gregorio Gematos' poems were first circulated, pasted anonymously around the city of Bahia in accusation or denigrating various public figures. So this untranslation by Augusto fills the page with a dramatic Black background and accuses the reader and the poet alike. This visual translation draws out a moment in which the popular satirical voice and materiality of Matos is elevated over and outside his Baroque form that was later anthologized and published in traditional publication. This blow-up of one stanza emphasizes a form of readership that, yes, does only look at one fragment, but is unafraid to look more closely at these underemphasized portions of a canonical figure. So just as José Emilio Pacheco created a heteronym to zoom in on racist discourses in Mexico from an oblique angle, Augusto blows up this section of Matos to ask how the literary tradition and how Brazilian culture writ large has failed to contend fully with its own anti-Black history. Augusto deploys the same techniques of selection, reduction, and reconfiguration in a series of untranslations or intraduções that he makes from another classic of the Brazilian canon, Os Sertões by Euclides da Cunha. In this geographical historical essay on the War of Canudos in the late 19th century in the Brazilian Sertão, or northeastern backlands, Cunha, as a war correspondent, reports on the dramatic rise of a charismatic leader named Antonio Conselheiro, and also the violent suppression of the precarious rural community by the Brazilian army. The source text of Os Sertões is very dense with naturalist description and also a deep ambivalence, displaying both suspicion of the rural rebels, but also dismay at the violence with which the state suppressed their uprising. Augusto crafts brief, poetic untranslations out of this hefty socio-historical treatise. Poems, he says, he, quote, obtained without alteration to the text or punctuation from the verbose source text. Augusto's untranslations ask what kinds of form can be found in the informed text of the original, as well as the wild beauty of the Sertão itself. These poems challenge notions of where a Brazilian aesthetic comes from and how it may circulate. Brazilian critics had dismissed some of the excessive poetry in this historiographic essay as signs of weakness. But for Augusto, those scholars really failed to appreciate Cunha when they reject his poetic language. So he gives readers of his untranslations only the most poetic of the language. Although all world literary anthologies or other kinds of abridged versions of canonical texts will engage in some kind of abridgment, fragmenting longer works, Augusto's exercise includes this canonical reading that critiques these particular poetic fragments as secondary to the central point of this work, as less objective, sociological, or historically accurate. And so he offers these untranslations as his own reading. So if, as David Damrosch has described, the two movements that propel a work into world literature are first to be read as literature, and second, to circulate outside of the source culture, Augusto here is insisting on the primacy of the first stage by performatively reading Os Sertões primarily as literature, in fact, primarily as poetry, even though the source text is written in prose. So unlike Pacheco's use of heteronyms, Augusto dispels the notion that his poems might be of his own invention, citing directly page numbers from his source text. So he's showing his work. And he gives this particular poem that I've placed here, titled O Prisionero, the prisoner, pride of place, writing that, quote, he changed this one the most, but still did not change it at all. So he's built a concrete poem from a sentence by making line breaks where there were commas, supporting his own perception that the poem was already present. He makes also an arrangement on the page in red of a crucifix, which kind of elevates the parallel between the followers of Christ and the canudos cangaceiros, which is present in Osertoes. The cangaceiros is a term meaning indigent or outlaw, a derogatory term journalists attached to the rebellious followers of Antonio Consigliero. And so the poem in a quick English translation reads, suspenso, or one suspended by his armpits between two posts, half fainted, had diagonally across his naked chest the drawing of a strong impression, the blade of the saber that felled him. In the untranslation, The Prisoner, Augusto draws out an element in the source text that represented Consigliero as a problematic Christ-like figure. However, while all the words remain, Augusto's interpolation of his own concrete aesthetics also shows us the way a visual poem might obscure with aesthetic distractions around the violence of the scene depicted. So the word diagonalmente, or diagonally, which is placed itself diagonally here, was originally referring to a wound left by a saber's blow on the prisoner's body. By placing this word at a diagonal and then also transforming the whole phrase into a visual figure that looks like a Christ on the cross, the adjective diagonally has now become perhaps the legs set at an angle, or a drape of cloth modestly covering the figure, or some combination. This choice then makes the violence of the source text both more visible and less visible. A Cannibal Translation both performs rewriting and erasure while also making the cut visible. So as with his blow-up of Gregorio Gematos, these repositioned and reorganized fragments of the Brazilian canonical source text magnify the embodied experiences of subaltern subjects of the Brazilian literary canon. So Augusto de Campos and José Emilio Pacheco are working with literary traditions that encode epistemological and physical violence. But in their world literature anthologies, they never present neutral, transparent, complete, or representative images of the world, although they are also both including major canonical figures of universal poetry. Instead, they encode the violence of prior translation cultures, in which imperialist erasure separated many indigenous peoples from linguistic self-determination. Their translation projects transgress the laws of one-to-one relationships between source text and translation, between author and translator. So with their world literature anthologies, created from a pose of casual fragmentary playfulness, they hold space open for the history and limitations of translation and the problematic inventions and selections always implicated in any translation practice. To share one of the many afterlives of these Cannibal Translation world literature anthologies that have moved from the 80s when they were originally published into the present day, I want to conclude with Augusto de Campos's new remixes of his translation practice on his Instagram account, where he has been reframing old and new works and showing them to be possibly leveraged into a commentary on the contemporary political situation in Brazil. His visual untranslations are such an amazing fit for internet culture and social media, so it almost feels as though he was waiting for the right platform to be invented for some of these pieces. I highly recommend a follow to his Instagram account at Poeta Menos, which he runs with the help of his granddaughter, Raquel. And so, for example, he has lent his artistic hand to the general rallying cry of support for the embattled Brazilian left. In this case, calling for the release when the former president Lula was in prison. So in this Instagram post, he remixed the Lewis Carroll doublets that I had before, this particular one that goes from preso to libre. But he's sort of refiguring it with a new caption. The older work was in fact composed in 1971, long before the constitutional article of the new Brazilian Constitution of the 80s, and before the soaring political career of Lula da Silva. So in this new 21st century iteration, the poem has the title, quote, "Enough Deception, Respect Inalienable Rights in the Federal Constitution, Lula Livre," doublet in the style of Lewis Carroll. And he's referring to the constitutional right that an accused can remain free until all of his appeals were exhausted. In another post, Augusto crafts a new doublet titled Doublet para Lula, in which the font he chooses or creates recalls the bullseye or sniper scope fixed on a targeted man, which we might imagine invokes the lawfare that the right wing in Brazil has engaged in by using corruption lawsuits as a way to gain political power. The words themselves read, Moro, Moto, Loto, Luto, Luta, Lula, moving from the name Sergio Moro, referring to the Minister of Justice under President Jair Bolsonaro, who led the Operation Car Wash anti-corruption lawsuit against Lula and other members of his administration. As the poem cycles through mottos, chance games, mourning, struggle, and ending with Lula, this doublet is playing a word game while also raising questions about the role of mottos, slogans, inflammatory speech, and in fact, digital activism itself in the rise of polarization and political violence in Brazil's public sphere. So with these Instagram remixes, I see Augusto holding translation open and performing Cannibal Translation as an ongoing relationship between multilingual spaces. Although the platform is certainly flawed, as is the framing apparatus of the World Literature Anthology, I see Augusto's work, along with other Cannibal translators, as crafting an audience for a critical Latin American translation praxis that invites readers in the process of remaking world literature to make it meaningful and useful in our present day. So many widely distributed anthologies of world literature do not do as much as these two to center translation tradition or to critique their own logic. One example that I found that does both is an online resource, the Open Anthology of Early World Literature in English Translation, where classic texts are presented in multiple open source English translations with a scholarly apparatus that discusses translation history. The different materiality of online publication does allow for this proliferation of versions that is gestured at in Pacheco and Augusto's critical world literature anthologies. I also see this responding to the call by Karen Emmerich and others for an increased translation literacy and a reframing from translation to a translingual edition, quote, which would center the mediated nature of all translations. What is missing in this project of the Open Anthology of Early World Literature, in my view, is the teeth of the Cannibal Translation that would sink into an ethical critique of English, Spanish, or any other dominant or colonial language as the repository vehicle for world literature. So I'll close there. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you to Dr. Joseph Ford for the invitation, and I'm honored to be a part of the seminars on world literature and translation. I look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isabel, for such a rich talk. I've written down so many questions and thoughts myself from that. So really just amazing. Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to getting my hands on the book when it's ready and reading it. So yeah, thank you so much. That was such a wonderful talk. I'm going to open the floor straight away. If people, I mean, we can give you a bit of a break, Isabel, but if people have questions, comments, points for discussion, then I'm just going to invite you can either turn your camera on, raise your hand. There's the Zoom raise hand function. You can post in the chat. Please feel free to to raise your questions. I mean, perhaps I could get us started with a question, and then people can kind of reflect on their notes and things. I'm really fascinated by this final section on the digital and the transformation to the digital space, and I'll certainly be checking out the Instagram account. I mean, you talked about like the limitations of the digital sphere, and I mean, I just wondered if you could say a bit more about how this relates to how we think about circulation and world literature. I mean, perhaps in comparison to how you were discussing in the anthologies, and perhaps, I mean, bringing in that question of the political reach and the political impact of these writers, and what kind of impact you see them as having through these forms of engagement, these digital forms or social media forms of engagement. You may not be able to answer that question, but I just wondered if you had any kind of thoughts on that, Isabel.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your reaction and question. And yeah, the move to the digital, I incorporated that just briefly in my conclusion, but it might be a whole other project. And with the specific case of Augusto de Campos, it's both his way of, as a 90-year-old poet, looking back on a life of poetic production and seeing how many of the themes that he has been concerned with for decades can be reframed for the contemporary political moment. He was delighted to be regrammed by Haddad, who unfortunately lost the election, but was the left-wing candidate. And that kind of increased his readership. So his Instagram account itself was kind of a niche, sort of viewed by, literary, scholarly nerds, poetry fans like most of us, but it was in many ways by beginning to engage directly through social media with some of the political figures he supported that he started to get an even broader following. And he was also trying to provide certain easily usable visual things that could be produced into posters, taken to demonstrations. So like other projects, like Prensa de Libertad that we see in Argentina, there's an amazing project. They take their name from Frank Ocean, which I'm not sure exactly why, but they're an online translation collective based in Chile. These are online organizations that I'm noticing are not always fully translating everything. Because they know they're circulating on Instagram, where everybody is already able to easily Google Translate something. They're both translating and then also allowing it to be acceptable to make a political statement in languages that not all of their viewers might read or see. So I think that's one of the repercussions of some of the Cannibal Translation gestures I'm tracing from the 60s and 70s and 80s in the present day, is a greater interest in consuming works in multiple languages at once, rather than seeing that a translation has brought it fully into a target language. I'll close this sort of reaction to your larger question just with another cool example, back to one of my source texts. There was a recent publication of the kind of worlds of Wonderland. So it takes selections of translations of Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll into all of the languages that's been translated. And this was so it's a 3-volume anthology that is also supported by essays by many of the translators themselves, or essays about these different translations into different languages. It includes a translation into an invented language, And in many ways, what I see these kinds of publications doing is insisting that we should be interested in things that we can't fully understand or consume immediately. So, and I think that has political repercussions as well. The holding space open for what we cannot fully grasp linguistically.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Isabel. Does anyone have a question or a comment or would like to raise their hand? I mean, I have plenty of questions, so I can go on. And you're very welcome to post questions in the chat. If you'd like me to read your question for you, then that's absolutely fine as well. I'm very happy to do that. I had a question about, if I may continue, I had a question about the this question, the cannibal, the figure of the cannibal, the figure of cannibalism, cannibal translation, the link with consumption, which is a term that comes up over and over again. It came up over and over again in your presentation, and the kind of embodied reality of that, the embodied nature of that. So I just wondered, I mean, it's quite a violent image, isn't it? Like, I mean, I see how, you know, you laid out very, you know, very extensively the kind of history of how this term comes to be used in this way. But I wondered if you could say a bit more about the violence of it and how that then is, you know, interpreted by the anthologists and kind of used in perhaps in a critical or to draw attention to a particular aspect of what's going on in translation. Yeah, I wondered if you could say a bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I am taking a strong choice by centering my rereading of Brazilian translation theory through the metaphor of and trope of cannibal translation. And I'm doing that for a specific reason. There's another, Oswaldo de Campos and Augusto de Campos also work with another term, which is much less violent, and for some scholars preferable and more of a legacy they want to attach to these major Brazilian translation theorists. And that other term is transcreation. So this term of translation as an art must also be an act, of creation. And the reason that I love this term too. I use it and I see it occurring. But what is missing, oftentimes a transcreation is operating very much within the text itself. But what I see as important of a cannibal translation is its interest in extra-textual factors, that its interest in including the process, and its interest in acknowledging the violence of translation. So in order to say translation can be a violent act of interacting with another, it's also then used to acknowledge that violence and try to come to terms with it. I think that the sort of cannibal metaphysics that some Brazilian philosophers are also interested in promoting through their own rereading of the Tupi-Guarani cultural practice and other sort of more anthropological approaches to that history. It also has to do with a revisiting of what is our category of the human. Why are human beings able to both enact violence on so much of the kind of planetary coexistence, and yet it's only seen as, you know, primitive or demonic when that violence is enacted on another human being? Like what kind of privileging of the human species is built into viewing the cannibal as the ultimate form of violence. So for those reasons, I have chosen Cannibal Translation as the sort of umbrella figure for these acts of critical translation practice rather than transcreation. And I see a lot of transcreation occurring, and yet often the way that they're framed, the kind of paratextual devices incorporated around them are, I think, what makes some of these transcreations also engaged in a violent rejection of other norms of translation. So yeah, that's one approach to responding. Another just small thing is, again, to center what is taking a Latin American translation practice on its own terms. So the term transcreation has been associated far more with Augusto De Campos's engagement with Derrida and Russian formalism. And what I like about Cannibal Translation is it's working through a more Latin American centered history of the Brazilian avant-garde and other moments in which there is a reclaiming of Caliban and the primitive as a rejection of former European focuses on Ariel. So that's another element of that choice that I made. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Isabel. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense as you laid out there. I'm looking at the chat because we've got some comments and a couple of questions. So I don't know if Nayali, I don't know if you want to come on live or you prefer me to read your question. I mean, I can invite people to come on to speak. If you'd like to, you can unmute yourself and put your camera on. Please read it. That's absolutely fine. I'm very happy to. So, and Nayeli is, I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly, Nayeli. Isabel, thank you so much for a very stimulating presentation. Can you elaborate on why you think that our lack of full linguistic grasp has political repercussions? So I think expanding on that discussion perhaps we were having earlier, Isabel.
Yeah, and this is one reason I love Augusto's, and he uses this term intradução, which I translate as untranslation, that kind of verbing rather than Emily Apter's like untranslatable. And so, yeah, for me, this insistence on always leaving a translation unfinished, always leaving a translation in relationship with a source, and often in fragmenting it and introducing it so that it is signaling its own total limitation. There is a constant performative staging of how much his choices and his hand is in the frame when he's doing an untranslation. Whereas, and I know this is somewhat a misreading of Emily Apter's untranslatable, because in many ways she, through the Dictionary of Untranslatable Terms, is focused on how certain terms that have been translated by different philosophical discourses. She's also kind of going back to Walter Benjamin's idea that the untranslatable is some kind of kernel. But what I think Augusto offers us instead is an activity to do with that, to have it always be a both and, rather than a kind of reference back to a primacy of an original. And why does this kind of inclusion of things that we can't necessarily understand because we don't speak every language in the world, why does that have political repercussions? I see this as particularly important in a maybe a US-centered context in which English-only movements have really gained traction in the public sphere when we are seeing hate crimes against people who are speaking other languages in public space, and to kind of insist that no, to see things in languages we do not understand is good, is aesthetically beautiful, is something that we can gain information from, even if it's not semantic information, it's other kinds of information. That is what I think Augusto offers us with untranslation. And that is what I think we need a lot of. And I don't know, I'd have to ask my colleagues located in the UK right now if they have been experiencing a similar increase in intolerance for linguistic diversity, and a similar way in which other forms of discrimination that are no longer acceptable are sometimes displaced onto linguistic discrimination. So those are the ways in which I see a real importance in translation practices that really remain in dialogue and reciprocity with source languages.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Isabel. Yeah, I mean, I can say that the UK, I mean, you know, one of my colleagues calls this linguophobia, so a kind of discrimination against languages. You know, I've not seen this personally. I mean, living in a city, a big kind of multicultural city like London, I don't think you see it that often, but I've certainly heard of instances of it from colleagues who are living in different parts of the UK. I don't know if anyone else on the call would have experience of that. But yeah, I think it is about displacing the kinds of discrimination, as you're saying, Isabel, that we're more used to onto a kind of language context. And it's something that we need to be aware of, you know, in a context of kind of cultural movements like Brexit. I mean, this has really just kind of fired up, I think, that kind of discrimination and targeting of it's quite upsetting, I think, you know, to work in this area and to kind of and to see that and to feel like one is sometimes losing a kind of metaphorical battle, but maybe the problem is that we kind of pitch it in the wrong way, you know, as a kind of battle, and actually this is about something, as you're arguing, you know, something more complex and something that is about thinking about the source, deconstructing the source, and thinking in reciprocity with source, or differently with source, with the idea of a source and a target, in a kind of binary way. So deconstructing the binary there. So yeah, no, that's really interesting. Thank you. I think there was another question in the chat about poetry being seen as a weakness. I don't know if the questioner wanted to come on and elaborate. Oh, they have elaborated in the chat. When we see poetry used so much in Latin America, reformed into something that's expressed as specifically Latin American, for example, José Mativersos Sencillos, I'm really murdering the pronunciation of that. And poetry is usually praised in other cultures as well, in Europe and Asia. Do you want to come back on that, Isabel?
Yeah, I'd love to. And thank you, Ritz, for your question and for your presence today. So the place of poetry, both within translation theory and also within ideas about world literature, is one of the like kind of underlying themes in my book project, because you're absolutely correct that there's a way in which in many internal national canons, what is seen as most powerful and with a lot of potential for building a national identity can be poetry. But then when we get into the framework of world literature, when we're asking about a literature outside of the nation that is circulating, we have a scholarly tendency to really focus on the genre not just of prose, but the genre of the novel, of the modern novel. And this happens for various reasons. Perhaps in some ways because the novel was seen as a genre of nation building, and then also kind of exported. So putting the kind of translation tactics used on poetry at the center of a translation practice for world literature is, for me, a way of trying to challenge that assumption that when we're talking about world literature, we're really talking about the global novel, which I think is not an assumption everybody makes, but can often occur when we're speaking about world literature. And so with the specific case of Augusto's viewpoint on Euclides da Cunha, that was not poetry. It's a sort of long, kind of generically complex work that's both more reporting, a historical essay on a late 19th century war in Brazil, and because it's fulfilling so many potential needs for telling an eyewitness story of this war, for participating in ideas of Brazilian naturalism, of like, how does our landscape shape who we are? It was criticized as being too poetic. And so Augusto was really, I think, along with the ideas of your question, saying, wait, all of a sudden we think poetry is not a positive element of this work. I'm going to translate this work and only focus on the most poetic passages. And you're still going to get, so if you read the whole series of his untranslations, he gives you, it would be less than 0.1% of the whole book, but he finds selections that give you all of the different beats, different characters, different concerns. So it's almost as though he gives you a highly abridged version only through poems taken out of this more socio-historical treatise. So yeah, can we translate different genres using this highly aestheticized approach to translating poetry? That's one challenge that I'm interested in thinking with. Like, what would it look like to not try to translate prose through the norms of prose?
Yeah, there is quite a kind of radical project in a way, and a really fascinating project, and a radical kind of deconstruction of what it means to translate. Thank you very much for your question. Did anyone else want to? I can see Lucia. You have your hand up.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Isabel, for that really wonderful talk. And I'm very sensitive to what you were saying just now, just a couple of minutes ago, about the kind of political uses and misuses of translation or erasure of translation, which for me at the moment is a very acute issue, because just now my colleagues and myself and our students are very sensitive to this, because the management of our institution wants to make 7 people redundant in our department, explicitly targeting comparative literature, translation and linguistics. And this apparently is in the interest of promoting world literature and global literature, so betraying an amazingly Anglocentric and vacuous notion of the world as a kind of indistinct blob where multilingualism and diversity of culture disappears, because if you don't look at the different languages and the different identities that are expressed to those languages, and how, as you were explaining so clearly, translation also means assertion of a different identity and political opposition against colonialism and so on. So all of this disappears. So this is a kind of, I have very strong feelings about this topic at the moment. So, but I want to go perhaps to a less emotionally charged question for me at the moment. And that's because you mentioned Dante and the translation of that line from Dante, which I really enjoy the way that to fall, Kai, appears at the end to reflect the actual original line rather than the morto. But that made me think of medieval translation and kind of cannibalizing, kind of repurposing of previous literature. And Rita Copeland describes medieval translation, as well as ancient Roman translation from the Greek, as expansion of the horizons of the language, borrowing, perhaps in your terms, cannibalizing the prestige of the source, but also competing with that source in order to assert the independence and power of the new language, of the new culture. So making the new language and culture possible through translation. And you've so wonderful spoken about the sort of cannibalizing and decolonizing. I was wondering whether you also see a drive to expand that signifying, similarly to what Copeland says, the signifying possibilities of Latin American, so Castilian or Brazilian Portuguese in the practice of the poets and translators that you discuss. And if so, do you see differences between different areas of Latin America and possibly between Brazilian and Spanish-speaking or Castilian-speaking areas?
Thank you so much, Lucia, for your question, for your, I have so much empathy for these institutional choices that, give us so much to fight against in the, sort of Anglophone assumption that that's what world literature is. But to answer your question along the lines of sort of expanding the horizons of a language, that gives me a great excuse to talk a little bit more about the fourth chapter of my book, where what I'm observing is a publishing project based in Caracas, Venezuela, that is trying to craft a new canon for Latin American literature, and to do so is translating Brazilian literature into Spanish. But that translation project is incredibly thoughtful in how it does so, to craft a kind of Spanish that remains in dialogue with some of the unique aspects of Brazilian Portuguese. So, for example, remains really attuned to elements of Tupi-Guarani, or like moments in which certain texts they're translating are crafting an Afro-Brazilian voice. But to do so, some of the translators who work for Biblioteca Ayacucho, this sort of 1970s, 1980s, like pan-Latin American translation project, the translators end up also crafting a form of Spanish that is very pan-Latin American as well. So they do research to find terms for certain objects in a Brazilian source text, plants, food types, things that are related to popular culture, like nursery rhymes. So to translate them, they often end up expanding them in a version that's more Central American, in a version that's more sort of Colombian. And so the act of translation, as you say, does become an expansion of the horizon of Spanish American Spanish. And this has to do with some of the norms of the source text in Brazil, because again, this is about translating not just any Brazilian literature, but Brazilian literature that had qualities of polyvocality, qualities of voices that are representing the regional diversity of a country as large as Brazil. And then to take that into Spanish, and another sort of element is you do see differences. So for some translators, doing this should be done in a very scholarly way, like heavily footnoted, where you kind of are sending flags to the reader. And for other translators, they want to do this in a very sort of artistic way, more on the transcreation side. And what ends up happening, editors end up needing to negotiate between these different translator approaches, but all of them are sharing, I think, what your question is calling to, which is how do these sort of translation activities provide a possibility for Spanish to expand in a Latin American space? And then just as one last note, I think it would be so amazing to imagine translating this translation anthology. So what Augusto de Campos has given us is something that is an object of its own. And I don't know if I'll do it, but I would love to experiment with translating it into English. Some of the source texts that he's working from are, of course, already in English, but he has operated on them in ways to highlight or emphasize. So I think that one of the ways in which we can see how these cannibal translation projects have expanded the horizon of their target languages is the ability to imagine translating them, even reciprocally, even into the source language of some of their sources. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucia, for your question. Thanks, Isabel. That sounds amazing. Just to thank you again, Isabel, for such a wonderful talk and such a rich account of the research you've done for your book. And we're absolutely delighted to have you as part of the seminar series. And I just wanted to extend my thanks to our supporters in LINKS, so the London Intercollegiate Network for Comparative Studies, the Institute of Modern Languages Research, and CLACS, the Centre for Caribbean and Latin American Studies. And finally, I should extend our thanks to our funder, which is the Convocation Trust of the University of London, for their generous support for the series. Isabel, thank you so much for your talk. And thank you to the audience for such stimulating comments and questions and discussion. So it just remains for me to wish you all a lovely rest of your day, a lovely evening, wherever you are in the world. Thanks, Isabel.
Many thanks to you. Delighted and honored to be a part of this seminar. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. And take care, everyone. Bye now.